Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. I'm Michael Simmons, the Spectator's data editor. This week, the magazine covered on Ed Miliband's empty energy promise and whether it's possible or whether we even should try to decarbonise by 2030. But how much do we really need to worry about the climate? To discuss that, I'm joined by political scientist Bjorn Lomborg. Bjorn, you became well known for your 1998 book, The Sceptical Environmentalist. The topic of climate change has changed a lot since then, both the science itself and its salience in the public. Are you less sceptical now than then?
Oh, Michael, fundamentally, no. I mean, global warming is still a real issue. But what the last 20 years of research has shown is that, yes, it is a concern, but it's not by any means this catastrophe that it's being sold as. Remember, most people actually now believe, so a new survey from the OECD countries showed that 60% of everyone believes that unmitigated climate change is likely or very likely to lead to the end of mankind. And it's just no such thing. Just this year, in 2024, two of the most prominent climate researchers have shown what is the total impact when you try to take all of the impacts from storms and hurricanes, droughts and floods and everything else, and also loss of wetlands and everything else that you can put into these equations. What is the net impact of all the damage that you see from climate change? They find somewhere between 2 and 3% of GDP loss by the end of the century. Yes, that's a problem. It's not the end of the world. And just to put it in context as well, remember the average person, according to the UN's best or most central prognosis, the average person in the world will, at the end of the century, be about 450% as rich as he or she is today. So we'll be much better off. Climate change means that we will, instead of being 450% as well off in 2100, will only be 435 or 440% as well off. Yes, that's a problem. No, it's not the end of the world.
It's fair to say then that whilst your position is you acknowledge climate change is real, do you think that governments are overreacting? And on the cover of The Spectator this week, we talk about the seeming collapse and the impossibility of Ed Miliband's plan to get to a decarbonised grid by 2030. Lots of governments have these 2030 net zero targets. Do you think these are an overreaction to a problem that you say is not as catastrophic as we're led to believe?
Well, there's certainly an overreaction in the sense that they're making promises that they just can't keep. And also remember, the goal is not to decarbonize the UK or even the EU. It's to decarbonize the world. Just simply pushing out everything from the UK, deindustrializing, and pushing out everything from the EU, deindustrializing, mostly move emissions somewhere else. You have to find a way to convince also China, India, and Africa, which are going to be the main contributors to emissions in the 21st century, to decarbonize. And so we're somehow pushing the wrong target if we think, oh, it's about us feeling virtuous. Well, what happens actually if all of the EU went carbon neutral today? And remember, the promises by 2030 is only for the electricity sector, which is a small part of the total emissions. But even if you imagine that the whole of the EU went net zero today, which of course would cause unbound problems almost everywhere in the EU. You probably wouldn't be able to get home. And we certainly wouldn't be able to feed most of the people here. Even if we manage to do that, if you plug that into the UN climate model, it shows that by the end of the century, it will reduce temperatures by 0.19 degrees. Yes, that's something, but it's not very much. What you really need is to convince everyone else. And again, if you look, for instance, at Germany, which has very often been taken out as the most astounding green transformation, they have this green Energiewende, the green transformation that they already legislated in 2010. If you look at Germany, most people, and certainly most poorer countries, don't look at Germany like something they want to aspire to. They look at it as a cautionary tale of what happens if you try to put the cart in front of the horse, if you try to move too fast in this. And what has actually happened, if you look at Germany since 2010, where their share of fossil fuels in their economy was 79.6, and there's a reason why I have to put the last digit in there. In in 2010, it was 79.6% of their energy came from fossil fuels. In 2022, that number is down to 79.3. At that rate, it's going to take them half a millennia to get to net zero. We're simply making promises that we can't keep. And that, I think, is the main issue. Spending lots of money and not actually finding a solution is a really bad deal.
But even if we say, let's say we accept that China is a huge emitter, as you say, if Europe decarbonises, it doesn't really make a big difference. It's arguably it's virtue signalling. But is there not a case that we should just be setting an example for the world? We should, if this is something we have to do anyway, we should get ahead of that curve and do it now, do it as quickly as possible.
We should definitely move ahead on trying to fix the problem. We shouldn't move ahead by doing stupid stuff that nobody wants to replicate. So what we should be focusing on is getting much more investment into green energy research and development. Remember, the only way you solve big problems, big global problems, that be climate or anything else, is not by telling everyone, I'm sorry, would you mind being poorer and less comfortable, colder in the winter and hotter in the summer? Would you mind not be able to drive your car or eat meat or go on an airplane? That is not going to win votes in the long run. The way you fix these problems is through innovation. We've done this many, many times before. So in the 1960s, the world worried about running out of food and there wouldn't be enough food for everyone. The solution was not to tell everyone to go a little more hungry so we could send more food to the developing world, or indeed, as many people suggested, just simply giving up and letting hundreds of millions or even billions of people die. The solution was the Green Revolution, the move from a lot of scientists to breathe varieties that deliver a lot more yield for every hectare of land that you farm. And this, of course, is why India has gone from a basket case to being a world-leading rice exporter. That happens through innovation. The trick here is not to try to do stuff that's costly and other people won't redo, but it's instead to come up with these solutions that'll actually be so cheap, everyone will want it. What we need to do is to make green energy, and that could be a lot of different things, but essentially energy that doesn't emit CO2 or emits very, very little CO2, make it so cheap that everyone will want it. Also the Chinese, the Indians, and the Africans.
And what innovations are needed to get green energy into that position? In Britain, we're very big on wind farms, but those have huge problems. There's a big project in the Shetland Islands to build wind farms that ended up producing so much energy that the grid couldn't actually take it. If we were to take this money away from decarbonisation and put it into these green innovations, what specific energy sources should we be looking at?
Sorry to interrupt, but if you're enjoying the show, why not subscribe to The Spectator? In September, you can get 3 months of website and app access absolutely free. Follow the Tory leadership campaign, Labour's inaugural budget and the US elections with Britain's best informed journalists. And get your first 3 months free, only in September. Go to www.spectator.co.uk/TV offer.
Well, Michael, I would love to be able to tell you what's the future of the rest of the world. I don't know. The whole point here is this is about finding new technologies. I can give you a lot of examples. So obviously, as you point out, we should be investigating more in making both wind and solar cheaper, but fundamentally, it's mostly about making batteries so incredibly cheap that they can back this up. Remember, a new study for the US shows that if you actually want to run the US on wind power alone, remember the problem with wind and solar and most other renewables is that they're fickle, they're intermittent. Sometimes they work and sometimes they don't, and we can't plan ahead for that. And so if you want a successful modern society, you need power 24/7. That means you need backup. And what that study showed was if you actually want to run the US just on wind, you need backup not for a couple of days, you need backup for 3 months. Remember, the US has batteries for about 7 minutes right now. So that's an enormous expansion. On current cost, this would cost about a third of US GDP every year. It's very likely that it would be the same ballpark estimates for the UK. That's just unaffordable. This is not going to happen. Possibly we can bring down the cost of batteries so much in the next, say, 50 years that would be a useful opportunity. Obviously, fourth generation nuclear, so small modular nuclear, could be an amazing opportunity, at least for electricity. Again, we've been promised that this will be much cheaper and much safer, but of course we were promised that for the other three generations of nuclear power. So again, we should be investing research money in this to try and see if it's actually this cheap and actually this effective. Many other ideas abound. Craig Venter, the guy who cracked the human genome back in 2000, he has this pretty startling idea of basically taking genetically modified algae and grow them on the ocean surfaces. What they'll do is essentially out there, they'll soak down sunlight and CO2 and produce oil. We'll essentially be growing our own oil fields, our own Saudi Arabias out on the ocean surface. And then we take out all that oil. We essentially keep our entire fossil fuel infrastructure. But because this oil was just grown out on the ocean surface, it's essentially CO2 neutral. It just soaked up the CO2 a couple of months ago. So we could potentially run our entire economy as we already do, but CO2 neutral. Again, this doesn't work right now. I mean, you can get it to work in the laboratory, but it's not anywhere close to commercializable. But the idea here is if we spent more money on research and development on all of these things, we just need one or a few of these thousands of ideas to work. And those are the ones that would power the 21st century.
What about green jobs? Industrial communities that have been coal mining communities in the US, in the UK, steel building communities, etc., are all told that this green revolution is going to be great for them because it's going to create thousands of jobs, and these, industrial workers that have been out of work, families that have been out of work for decades since the coal mines were shut, are suddenly going to find a new, essentially heavy industry that's going to employ their families for generations. Do you think that's true, or is that how governments are selling it?
Well, green jobs is a very fickle category. We've certainly been sold on a lot of these things. It's not happened very much. But the real point, again, here is to remember the goal is not to create as many jobs as you possibly can. Milton Friedman, one of the Nobel laureates in economics, once famously said, why are people just digging out with shovels? Why don't you just give them teaspoons? Then you would have to hire a lot more people to dig out the same amount of stuff. The goal is not to hire as many people as possible. In the US, this is a couple of years ago, but every person working in the gas industry could produce as much energy as 38 people in the solar industry. But of course, what that means is not you've suddenly created 37 new jobs. It means that they're 38 times less efficient. It means that 37 people who can't work as teachers or as nurses or as road diggers or anything else that would be much more productive for society. This is not a goal about employing as many people for the energy that you're producing. The way we got rich is exactly the opposite, is by having as few people working so that all of these people can work in other productive areas. So I get the allure, but it's just simply it's a misstatement of what we're actually trying to achieve. What we should be focusing on is to get efficient energy, which will help everyone become much more productive in everything they do. This is true in rich countries, but remember, it's especially true in the poor half of the world that still lacks a lot of energy, that wants a lot more energy, and that's quite frankly a little appalled about the way that we're saying, you know what, you need less energy because we're comfortable in our lives. But of course, that doesn't mean that most of the people in the world are satisfied with being at poverty level or just above poverty level.
And if we can move on to how sort of the climate change is seen by the wider scientific community, it's fair to say that you're a kind of unique voice. You've been criticised by aspects of the scientific community for what you say about climate change. Do you think that views are going to swing round to yours? We certainly see in the public, in electoral systems, that there seems to be a public backlash against the alarmism and the net zero. Do you think that's going to happen in the scientific community too, or do you expect to continue as sort of a lone voice?
So you're certainly right. There's a lot of people criticizing me. I think most of them are simply saying we don't like those conclusions because they're inconvenient to the political message that we're trying to put ahead. Just one example, a lot of people spend a lot of time researching and arguing for and worrying about heat deaths. And heat deaths are real, and they're certainly scary. The point that I've tried to make and is vastly documented in the literature is there's much more cold death than there's heat death. And as we see temperatures rise, heat death goes up, but cold deaths go down even further, which means in the short run and medium term, global warming actually saves lives. That's an incredibly inconvenient fact, but it's one that we need to recognize. And of course, both of these, both heat deaths and cold deaths, is best fixed by having access to a lot of cheap energy, so you can keep cold in the summer and you can keep warm in the winter. But going to your question, I think we have produced a lot of researchers that are very worried about climate because that's where they get their money. And so, no, we will keep getting a lot of these stories out, and that's part of what powers a lot of the worry that we have and the bad policies that we produce. But the fundamental point from climate economics, so remember, climate change is about what will happen in the physical system, but what we do about climate change is about how we make policies and ask, how much are they going to solve the problem and how much are they going to cost? That is, what benefit are they going to drive, but also what damages are they going to cause on our economies? The economic side has consistently showed for the last 3 decades, yes, climate change is the problem. No, it's not the end of the world. We should do something, but we should not be doing too much. And so in that sense, I think you're right that the populations are much more concerned about this, because now we've come to the point where you actually have to pay for all these beautiful promises we've made for climate change, and those are going to be very costly.
It's interesting that you mention the cold deaths versus heat deaths study. That's something that we've mentioned in the Spectator magazine a few times. And every time we mention it, it will get more and more complaints to the press regulator, complaints to our fact-checking team than almost any other topic that we mention, other than perhaps trans issues. And those complaints often can be quite vicious, malicious. Do you find the same thing in the world of academia, that because you're speaking out like this, do people use underhand tactics? Is there an effort to kind of silence these more less alarmist views?
Oh, of course, it's incredibly inconvenient. And so you actually see quite a number of people saying there'll be more heat deaths and more cold deaths in the long run, which is actually true because we're going to have a world that's much older. I don't know if you saw Guterres, the UN Secretary General, a couple of months ago or something, said that there's, among old people, 85% more old people are now dying from heat than did just 22 years ago. But what he failed to tell you is that there's also 86% more old people in the world. And so, of course, it's misleading information, but I understand how you do this. And I understand why it's such a powerful message. So I get that you get a lot of complaints. I certainly get a lot of complaints. But again, this is not about who complains the most. It's what the facts actually show. And the facts are very clearly most or almost everywhere on the planet, cold deaths vastly outweigh heat deaths. And so if you're concerned about heat deaths because you're sort of politically motivated, we need to do something about climate change, surely you should also be equally concerned about all the people and the very many more people that die from cold. And you need to say that. You need to say that very clearly, and you need to point out the hypocrisy when people are not willing to embrace such an obvious point.
And just finally, if, you say at the end of this century, we're not all going to have burnt to a crisp, what vision do you have for that time? What is the world going to look like?
So I think the fundamental point is that we're going to be in a much, much better place. Let's just leave aside nuclear war and some concerning bioterrorism and other things, and AI, which there are people who are researching this saying these are real and serious concerns. This is not my area of expertise, but certainly on the standard predictions and the ones that we see from the UN, we are going to be in a much better place. We're going to be better educated. We'll live longer. We'll have more food. We'll have better access to pretty much everything. Our kids will be better educated, and so on. This is fundamentally an optimistic view. And that's what all the research and all the prognoses estimate for the end of the century. Our decision is then to say, are we going to leave the world even better, or are we going to leave it less better because of our decisions here today? If we spend an enormous amount of resources on a faulty green transition, we will leave our descendants less well off. If we focus on smart solutions, and that's partly spending more on green energy research and development, but it's also to remember there are lots of other problems in the world. We're certainly seeing that in the rich world from, we need defense from Russia. We need more understanding of how we're going to deal with education that's faltering, how we can deal with an aging population. We have lots of other problems that we're neglecting because we're so over worried about one issue. And of course, for the rest of the world, for the poor part of the world, they actually just want their kids to stop dying from easily curable infectious diseases, get better education, get enough food. These are simple points. And we're at our own peril. We're so focused on one thing that we're forgetting to tackle all the other issues. And I think we have a moral responsibility to tackle climate change rightly, which demands real efforts and real investments, but also constrained investments so that we actually have enough to worry about all these other issues.
Bjorn, thank you.
Thank you.